For this next video, I'm going to be talking about the Terran versus Terran matchup, and specifically how to defend against when your opponent goes very fast siege mode for their siege tanks. So the main thing that works, the main sticking point that allows this strategy to be defended against is that there's not enough gas for a player to go fast siege mode and for fast Vikings. And so what we can do if we see our opponent is pushing with tanks early on and they start setting up siege, is go for a heavy Viking count. If you have less siege tanks but air superiority, once you've got siege mode up, it's pretty easy to push out and make your units much more efficient even though you've got less of them. And we'll see that later on in the video. So let's go ahead and start this up. For those of you who don't know Atero, he's a random player, and so you'll see my build is very generic at the beginning here. Usually I don't wall in against a Terran opponent, but since he was random I didn't want to take the chance because I always wall in when I'm playing against Zerg. And so I go for very standard barracks at 12 supply, 13 gas, as does he. Pretty fast orbital command, we scout each other, and from this point on the game is pretty standard. The main deviation you're going to see is some early Hellion play, and then he goes into fast siege mode, as I mentioned earlier, and whereas I go for a faster starport, put a reactor on said starport and start pumping out Vikings. So you might be wondering, well, QXC, how do I know he's going fast siege mode? You can't see when the tech lab is researching something, but the lack of other high-tier gas-heavy units should give you some kind of indication. The other thing is, if they're going for some fast siege build, they're going to be more aggressive early on in general. There's not a big reason to rush siege mode and then sit at your base and defend. Siege tanks without siege mode are plenty strong, and it leaves you vulnerable to things like Banshees. Since the fast siege mode means your anti-air stuff is going to be weaker, your Vikings are going to be later, and you'll have Marines, but you don't really want to be defending against Banshees with Marines. So here you can see my first Hellions coming out. I've got a bunch of Marines. Take my second gas a little bit before this, and then I get my tech lab. And so here, notice how I put my Hellion to the side of those Marines. It's a little more vulnerable to attack, but that line fire makes it so it hits many more units than it would have otherwise. So here I'm pushing to his base. I want to see if I can do a little bit of damage. Pretty much once it's most likely he's going tanks at this point, so once the first tank comes out, I'm planning to fall back. You see a little miss micro there, I end up losing 2 units for no real reason. And I've also got my tanks coming out and my starport. So pretty fast reactor here. I don't have a whole ton of gas, so my siege mode's a little bit later than his. And you can see, start my expansion much earlier. Since I'm building a reactor instead of going straight into Vikings, while that reactor's building, I'm going to end up with a surplus of minerals. Since I'm not, if I had built a Viking right away, that's 150 minerals over 42 seconds. I'm building that reactor, so I end up saving 100 minerals over the tech path that Atero chose. Not only that, but my siege mode is a lot later. You can see his siege mode is already done. So the key here is I don't want to fight into siege tanks, especially not at a choke point like that with Marines at the front. If I lose a battle at my ramp like that, the game is over. Losing big battles right outside your base is probably the easiest way to lose a game. And so here I land my Vikings because until siege mode is done, they're not going to be useful in the air. They're really just for spotting for my tanks. And so I was prepared in case he decided to take all his units and push at me, those 2 Vikings on the ground would have been extra firepower. So you can see he's got 1 Viking, I've got 2, and he falls back because he sees that my siege mode is ready. So now he mismicros one of those Vikings, and it's a big deal. Now I have air superiority. I can start pushing up with my tanks. Notice how I bait his Marines a little bit, and the tanks actually pick them off. This is pretty important. It makes it so I'm totally uncontested here. He has to have more Vikings in order to push me back. And so what I'm going to keep doing now is edging my siege tanks closer. Siege tanks have higher attack range than they do vision. So you can see that Viking is actually giving it vision so that it can attack. If his Viking had gotten closer and given his tank sight, I could have attacked it with my Viking. And so the only way for him to get vision is to use scans. Scans are finite, and scans are mules that aren't being dropped, so they effectively cost money. And so if your opponent's using scans to do this kind of tank stuff, you're at an advantage. Not only that, but if they scan and you fall back, they've just wasted it. All they've done is buy themselves time. They haven't actually done any damage to you. So you can see my Vikings are just continuously giving me vision and allowing me to pick off his tanks. Because I've got that reactor that I put on so much earlier than he did, it's going to be really hard for him to catch up in terms of Viking count. Pretty much whoever has more Vikings wins the air battle. Vikings kill Vikings really effectively. It's super tough for you to battle a larger number of Vikings with a smaller number without some kind of support. Sometimes you can add in some Thors or Marines, but Marines die pretty well to tanks, and Thors are super expensive. Instead of getting Thors, a lot of the times it makes more sense to just make more Vikings. You can see the units lost here is pretty imbalanced. I'm definitely ahead. And you notice how his tanks, I've killed so many tanks that haven't done any damage in return because of those Vikings giving me air superiority. And this is all due to the fact that his early siege mode aggression didn't pay off. He didn't do enough damage with it to warrant slowing down his Viking production. And so I got a Viking count ahead of him. He mismicroed one of the early Vikings, but regardless, my later siege mode allowed me to get that earlier reactor and start pumping the Vikings, which led to me just having this total air dominance. And at this point, there's not a whole lot he can do. I land the Vikings in the back of his base. It's not really necessary. I could have just kept pushing with my tanks, just leapfrogging them with the Vikings, providing air support. And you can see in my base, I've got my third going up. I've got my second mining, but I don't really have a lot of production here. This isn't a mass pump units and overwhelm them. This is a very fine finesse kind of control. Just moving the Vikings close enough to give vision to the tanks, so that your tanks can do damage without taking it back. And then just making sure you don't lose those Vikings, maintaining air superiority. And as long as you position your tanks so you're always outnumbering the tanks that are in range. So let's say he's got 4 tanks and you've got 3 tanks, and you want to kill those 4 tanks. You want to find a position where you can siege your 3 tanks in range of only one of his tanks. And you should be able to do that by using your Vikings to spot. You can figure out, like, okay, click on his tank, like this is the range, and then get just inside of it, just right by those white arrows that appear, and you'll be in range, but you'll be out of sight. And then even if he scans, you're outnumbering him 3-1, and it'll take too long for him to unsiege those other tanks and help out. One thing you want to be careful of is if he sees you unsiege, and then you push his Viking back or whatever, saw it, like a barracks or whatever, he's probably going to suspect that you're going to push up with your tanks really close after. So a lot of times his Viking will fly in, you're unsieging because you're getting ready to push out. You drive the Viking off, and then 3 seconds later he scans preemptively. And so it's stuff like that. Instead of pushing out after he sees you on siege, just re-siege, wait 10 seconds, throw off his timing, and then go for it. It's all about just positioning your tanks, maintaining vision of the enemy tanks, and putting your tanks in a position where they outnumber the enemy tanks. And you should have no problems dealing with a siege first build like that. This is QXC. I hope this has been interesting. GG.